I sent a cruel message to my cheating wife while she was at dinner with her lover. The luxurious environment, the soft lights, the subtle sound of jazz in the background, everything seemed to conspire to make it the perfect setting for their clandestine romance. They were comfortably seated at a corner table, away from prying eyes, lost in hushed laughter and seductive glances. It was as if the world around them didn't exist. On my side, the world was falling apart. The pain cut deep, my heart hammered in my chest as if it wanted to explode, but the coldness dominated my every movement. I had planned that moment, carefully orchestrating every detail, while they, blinded by desire, let themselves be carried away by the illusion that they were in control. The message I sent wasn't just words typed on a screen, it was a declaration of war, a silent explosion that I knew would destroy any shred of false happiness they were trying to build. The words, sharp as knives, found their target. The moment she picked up her cell phone, her face transformed. Her lover, at her side, froze as he saw her expression change from pleasure to terror. The night, which began as a perfect escape for the two, was now about to collapse into an abyss of painful and unexpected revelations. They had no idea that I already knew everything. Which, in fact, I always knew. But what was really behind that message? Was I simply avenging a betrayal? Or was there something more, something they could never predict? The truth is that the game they believed they were playing was never theirs. And the message I sent was just the first move in a match I had every intention of winning, whatever the cost. When their world finally fell apart, when the mask of happiness completely fell apart, there would only be silence. And in that silence, a secret that only I knew. But what would happen when they discovered the truth? New York never sleeps, but that late afternoon, the city's lights seemed even more vibrant, reflecting the intensity of emotions that hung in the air. In a luxurious loft, overlooking Central Park, lived Ethan, a middle-aged, successful man, but with a dull shine in his eyes. In business, Ethan was unbeatable. His investment company had grown exponentially over the years, the result of his acumen and almost cold determination. However, deep down, his world had turned gray, especially in the last few months. Claire, his wife, was Ethan's opposite in almost everything. With a free and youthful spirit, she filled the room with her vibrant presence. At the time they met, Claire was an emerging artist with a promising career in the fine arts. Her marriage to Ethan provided her with financial stability and a life of luxury, but little by little, something was lost between the two. Claire began to feel suffocated by Ethan's pragmatism, by the lack of emotions in his conversations, by the nights he stayed late at the office. The initial passion turned into a monotonous, predictable routine, and she found herself yearning for something more. It was on one of these lonely nights that Claire met Daniel, a young photographer who frequented the same art galleries as her. Daniel was everything Ethan wasn't, spontaneous, fun, and full of life. He could see beyond the facade that Claire displayed to the world, he could see the complex and desire-filled woman that existed behind the perfect wife. The involvement between the two began innocently, an exchange of glances, conversations about art that lasted into the early hours of the morning. But soon, the casual encounters turned into something deeper, something Claire knew she couldn't control. Ethan, on the other hand, has always had a keen sixth sense for business, and eventually, that instinct extended to his personal life as well. He began to notice small changes in Claire's behavior. She was more distant, spent more time away from home, and when she was present, her thoughts always seemed elsewhere. Contrary to what Claire imagined, Ethan was not oblivious to these changes. He felt the distance, but instead of confronting her, he preferred to observe in silence, calculating each move, as if he were dealing with a complicated negotiation. The setting for Ethan and Claire's wedding was a luxurious mansion in one of the most exclusive areas of Manhattan. The contemporary designed apartment was a reflection of the life Ethan had built, organized, sophisticated, and somehow empty. The living room was a large space, with glass walls that offered a stunning view of the city, but despite all the beauty, there was a palpable coldness to the environment, something that no designer furniture or work of art could hide. Silent dinners, occasional meetings at social events and the few words exchanged before bed were now the routine that defined their relationship. While Claire became increasingly involved with Daniel, Ethan immersed himself in work, but not without keeping a close eye on events around him. Claire and Ethan's apartment was equipped with state-of-the-art security systems, something Claire rarely paid attention to. Discrete cameras, a network of sensors that monitored movements inside and outside the loft. Nothing that would seem out of the ordinary, except to someone who knew exactly where to look. In recent weeks, Claire's outings have become more frequent and longer. Ethan observed these patterns more and more, noting the times, the places she frequented. The facade of the inattentive husband was just that, a facade. Ethan had contacts and resources that Claire had never imagined, and when he began to suspect something was wrong, he didn't hesitate to utilize each of them. Private investigators, vehicle trackers, and even software discreetly installed on Claire's cell phone. Daniel was careful, but not careful enough. He and Claire met in public places, but always felt like they were being watched. What they didn't know was that this feeling wasn't just paranoia. Ethan was always one step ahead, aware of every step Claire took, every message exchanged, every lie told. The relationship between Claire and Daniel intensified, becoming more than just an escape from reality. She found herself increasingly involved, drawn to the mystery and passion Daniel offered, something she hadn't felt in her marriage for a long time. However, guilt began to weigh on his shoulders. Ethan's cold gaze, his calculated words, the way he didn't seem to notice the changes, it all made her wonder if he really didn't know, or if he just didn't care anymore. Behind his controlled facade, Ethan was planning his next move. He knew that confronting Claire directly wouldn't solve anything. Instead, he bided his time, watching as the web of lies unfolded before him. The cruelty of his final message, the one he sent during Claire and Daniel's dinner, was the result of weeks of cold, calculated planning. Ethan wasn't the type of man to act on impulse. Every word of that message had been designed to hit Claire at the exact point of her vulnerability. As Claire increasingly gave in to the illusion of new love, Ethan continued to prepare for the inevitable outcome. He wasn't a man to leave loose ends, and what Claire and Daniel didn't know was that their every move was being watched and recorded. Ethan knew that, at the right time, he would have complete control of the situation, and when he decided to act, there would be no escape. Claire and Daniel's routine seemed to turn into a film that played in slow motion, each encounter charged with tension, each touch, a calculated risk. The game the two played was dangerous, but the excitement of the forbidden was irresistible. They carefully chose the places where they met, always in discreet locations, far from Claire and Ethan's social circles. Daniel, always cautious, insisted on maintaining a low profile, suggesting cafes in less frequented neighborhoods or art exhibitions on the outskirts of Brooklyn, where they were less likely to be recognized. Meanwhile, Ethan continued to live his life with the same calculated precision he applied to business. He worked tirelessly during the day, closing deals, holding meetings, all while maintaining the facade of a man focused on his professional success. But deep down, he knew the real challenge awaited him at home. Claire's presence in the nights they spent together seemed increasingly absent, like a ghost that wandered through the house, without really being there. One of these days, during one of their usual silent dinners, Claire commented, almost casually, that she had an important exhibition at a museum next week. Ethan, without looking up from his plate, just nodded. He knew that this event would be the perfect pretext for another meeting with Daniel, and in silence, he began to plot his next move. He had already studied every pattern, every exit, every excuse. I knew that, on the night of the exhibition, Claire would plan to meet Daniel, perhaps even to escape the suffocating routine that surrounded them. The week passed slowly and agonizingly. Claire, increasingly involved in the lie she had constructed, planned the meeting with Daniel down to the smallest detail. She could barely contain her anxiety, imagining the moment she would escape the golden prison her life had become. Daniel, in turn, shared his own feelings of excitement and dread. He knew they were on dangerous ground, but the pull was too powerful to ignore. When the night of the exhibition finally arrived, Claire prepared meticulously. She chose an elegant, deep red dress, something she knew would draw attention, but which also had a touch of rebellion that she so longed for in her life. Ethan watched as she got ready, his cold eyes taking in every detail, never revealing the whirlwind of emotions that boiled inside. He complimented her with a controlled smile, commenting on how she looked especially beautiful that night. Claire smiled back, but her eyes were distant, focused on what came next. The exhibition was a success. Claire received praise for her works, and amid the buzz of conversations and the clicking of champagne glasses, she felt the adrenaline coursing through her veins. But behind that charming smile, her mind was fixed on a single thought: Daniel was waiting for her outside, ready to take her away from those oppressive walls. When the exhibition ended, Claire quickly said her goodbyes, claiming to be exhausted after the busy night. She told Ethan that she would go home early and he, as always, showed no objection, wishing her a good night. But upon leaving the museum, Claire did not head home. Instead, she got into a taxi that took her straight to a restaurant hidden on one of the less busy streets in the East Village. Daniel was waiting for her at a table in the corner, out of sight of the other customers. When she entered, he greeted her with a smile that mixed relief and passion. It was as if time stopped for both of them at that moment, where only each other's presence mattered. Claire sat down, her heart racing, while Daniel held her hand under the table, as if that could protect them both from the outside world. Ethan, in turn, had not left the exhibition. As Claire left, he said goodbye to his acquaintances with the same cordiality as always, but his destination was different. He drove calmly through the city, the lights of the metropolis reflecting off his car as his thoughts were fixed on the plan he had drawn up. When he arrived at the restaurant where Claire was with Daniel, he parked at a safe distance, discreetly watching the entrance. Inside the restaurant, Claire and Daniel talked in whispers, laughing about little things, about the absurdity of their separate lives. Claire talked about how she felt alive with Daniel, something she hadn't felt in a long time with Ethan. Every word of affection, every whispered promise, was one more brick in the wall she was building between her marriage and her new life. Then, it happened. Just as Claire leaned in to kiss Daniel, her cell phone vibrated on the table. Claire hesitated, a feeling of dread creeping up her spine as she reached for the device. Daniel noticed the change in her expression and frowned, worried. She unlocked her phone and what she saw made her heart almost stop. It was a message from Ethan. The words, sharp and direct, cut the air like invisible blades. Shock coursed through Claire's body, her face instantly turning pale. Daniel looked at her, confused, trying to understand what was happening. The look she gave back was full of fear and desperation, something he had never seen from her before. The atmosphere around them seemed to freeze, as the words on Claire's cell phone screen forever changed the course of that night. Ethan, on the outside, knew exactly the impact his words would make. And as he awaited the inevitable outcome, the knowledge that control was still in his hands brought a cold smile to his face. The game was about to change for good, and what would be left for Claire and Daniel after that night? The message Claire received seemed to freeze time. The restaurant's atmosphere, once warm and intimate, transformed into a field of silent tension. Ethan's words were few but precise. Claire read and reread them, feeling a wave of panic rising in her throat. Daniel, sitting across from her, noticed the abrupt change in her expression and leaned in closer, whispering with concern. "What happened, Claire?" he asked, his voice full of anxiety. She didn't respond immediately. Her eyes were fixed on the cell phone screen, as if she expected the words there to disappear, that everything was nothing more than a nightmare from which she would wake up at any moment. But what was written there was undeniable, a raw, painful truth that she couldn't ignore. "He knows," Claire finally murmured, her voice shaking. "What do you mean, he knows?" Daniel frowned, his tone now full of urgency. "What did he say?" Claire took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. There was no way to soften the impact of those words. They were there, in his mind, echoing like a dark warning. With a look of despair, she handed the cell phone to Daniel, letting him read the message for himself. Daniel's expression quickly changed. He went from confused to shocked and finally to terrified. The message left no room for interpretation. Ethan knew everything, and more than that, he was in control. The panic that Daniel tried to hide was evident in his eyes, and Claire felt the gravity of the situation grow even more. "We have to get out of here," he said quickly, already starting to get up. But Claire remained frozen, her hands shaking. His mind was racing, trying to understand how things had gotten to this point. How had Ethan found out? How was he so sure of his betrayal, to the point of acting so coldly? And, more importantly, what would he do now? "Claire, come on." Daniel insisted, louder this time, pulling her by the hand. She finally stood up, almost tripping over her own feet as they headed for the exit. The air felt heavy, difficult to breathe. Outside, the New York night was cold, and the silence of the streets contrasted with the chaos in their minds. They didn't have a plan, they didn't know where to go. They just knew that they needed to get away, that the distance might offer them some time to think. But when they turned the corner, leaving the restaurant, a familiar figure was waiting for them. Ethan was there, standing in the soft light of a streetlight, with his hands in his pockets and an unwavering gaze. He didn't seem surprised, he wasn't angry. There was something infinitely more dangerous in his expression, a disconcerting calm, the certainty of a man who had planned every step of that moment. Claire stopped abruptly, feeling her legs weaken. Daniel took another step forward, as if he wanted to protect Claire, but the truth was he had no idea what to do. Ethan took a step toward them, and then, surprisingly smoothly, he spoke. "I hope dinner was to your liking." His voice was calm, but filled with cutting sarcasm. Daniel swallowed hard, his body tense. He tried to maintain his composure, but it was difficult to ignore the weight of the situation. Claire, on the other hand, felt on the verge of breaking down, her eyes fixed on the man who, until then, had been her compliant husband. "Ethan," Claire began, but was interrupted. "No, Claire." He raised a hand, interrupting her with a firmness she had never seen before. "I've heard enough from you. Now, it's my turn to speak." The silence that followed was crushing. Daniel looked at Claire, but she was just as lost as he was. Ethan took another step forward, his eyes fixed on Claire, never looking away. "You know, Claire, I always imagined something like this could happen," he said, his tone soft in contrast to the content of his words. "Not because you're a bad person, but because we, as a couple, were failing. And I, more than anyone, know what it means to fail." Claire felt a shiver run down her spine. There was something deeply disturbing about the way Ethan spoke, as if he were recounting an inevitable event, something he had already accepted. "But don't be fooled, Claire," he continued, now directing his gaze at Daniel, who immediately flinched. "When I realized what was happening, I decided not to be a victim. I've always been someone who takes control of my own life, and this time would be no different." Daniel tried to say something, but the words died in his throat. Ethan's gaze on him was one of pure contempt, as if Daniel was nothing more than an insignificant obstacle. "I followed your every step," Ethan revealed, his voice low but full of authority. "Every message, every meeting, every lie. And now, we are here. You underestimated me, and that was the worst mistake you could have made." The air around them felt like it weighed a ton. Claire looked at Daniel, looking for some kind of support, but he looked as lost as she did. There was no easy way out of this situation, and Claire knew that Ethan's next move could change everything. "I could destroy you right now," Ethan said, his tone icy. "But where would be the fun in that? Where would the justice be?" Daniel finally found his voice, albeit shaky. "What do you want, Ethan?" he asked, fear showing in every word. Ethan looked at him with a half smile, an expression that was almost compassionate but carried a dark weight. "I want you to understand, Daniel," he said, crossing his arms, as if he were about to teach an important lesson. "I want you to feel what I felt. The betrayal, the pain, the humiliation. But I also want Claire to see it for what it really is." Claire felt her heart sink. What was he about to do? What else could he know? And then, with terrifying calm, Ethan reached out and showed the screen of his cell phone. It was a video of a night Claire thought would never see the light of day again. A moment of weakness, something she had buried in her memory, something only Ethan knew. "I'm not the only one you betrayed, Claire," Ethan said, his voice sharp. "But I'm the only one you should never have underestimated." Shock spread across Claire's face, and Daniel looked at her, confused and horrified. The revelation was like a punch in the gut, something neither of them were prepared to face. Ethan, seeing their reaction, simply turned to walk away, leaving them with the brutal truth he had just unleashed. "Enjoy the night," he said, without looking back. With those words, he disappeared into the darkness, leaving Claire and Daniel alone with the devastation he caused. Claire stood there, frozen, feeling as if the world had shattered into 1,000 pieces around her. Daniel looked at her in disbelief, still trying to process what had just happened. Ethan's revelation had fallen upon them like an avalanche, crushing any illusion of control they might have had. "Claire, what was that?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He could hardly believe what he had just seen. She didn't respond right away. Tears pooled in her eyes, but she couldn't cry. Not there, not then. He needed to process everything, understand how his life had fallen apart so quickly. I don't know," Claire murmured, her voice breaking. But she knew. He knew exactly what Ethan was implying, and dread filled his heart. Daniel, however, deserved to know the truth. "Daniel, I didn't want things to come to this," she began, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to overflow. "I made a mistake, a big mistake, long before I met you." Daniel frowned, trying to follow the confusion of feelings emanating from Claire. The fear in his eyes, the shame in his voice, it all suggested there was something much bigger than he could imagine. "I was lost, Daniel," she confessed, finally letting the tears flow. "Before the two of us, before all this, she hesitated, swallowing hard. "I cheated on Ethan, but not with you. With someone else. And I never told him." The shock hit Daniel like an icy wave. He looked at Claire, trying to reconcile the woman he loved with the image she had just revealed. A part of him wanted to walk away, wanted to believe that it was all a nightmare, but another part knew that the situation was much more complex than he could imagine. "And does he know?" Daniel asked, his voice breaking. "He found out, but didn't confront him," Claire replied, the words coming out with difficulty. "I thought it was all buried, that I would never have to deal with it again. But he knew all along, and now." Daniel moved away a little, trying to absorb everything. The betrayal he thought was just between the two of them now seemed like just the tip of the iceberg. Ethan knew more, much more, and was using it to manipulate them. "Claire, what does he want with all this?" Daniel finally asked, trying to understand the game they were trapped in. "I don't know, Daniel," Claire admitted, her voice full of despair. "But one thing is certain, he won't stop here. Ethan is not the type of man to forgive or forget. He will do everything to destroy us." Her words hung in the air, filled with growing terror. Daniel, who until then had always believed he could control the situation, now found himself completely powerless. Ethan wasn't just a betrayed man, he was a ruthless strategist, and they had walked right into his trap. Daniel's phone vibrated, breaking the tense silence between the two. He took it with shaking hands and looked at the screen. A new message, this time addressed to him. The sender was Ethan. Upon opening the message, Daniel felt his blood run cold. "Now it's your turn, Daniel," the message said. Let's see what you're really capable of doing when you're not with Claire. Let's see if you can survive the same hell I went through. Daniel looked at Claire, the desperation in both their eyes was palpable. Ethan wasn't just plotting simple revenge. He was willing to play them to the limit, and every step they took would now be controlled by him. The game was far from over, and Ethan's next moves could be even more devastating. Suddenly, the gravity of the situation became unbearable. Daniel knew they needed to make a decision quickly, before Ethan took the next step. But which would it be? They were at a dead end, with an enemy who knew their weaknesses better than they knew themselves. And with that, the night that began with promises of a new beginning, now turned into a nightmare from which they could not wake up. But one thing was certain, the climax of that wicked game was far from being reached. They would have to face the consequences of their actions, each step meticulously planned by Ethan. And what would happen next would be a fight for survival, not just of their relationship, but of their own lives. Silence fell between Claire and Daniel as they stood on the sidewalk, still under the impact of the revelations that hit them with the force of a hurricane. Each of them struggled to find a way to deal with the new reality that surrounded them, but what they both realized was the unbearable weight of the choices they had made. The streets of New York, normally so vibrant, now seemed strangely deserted, reflecting the emptiness spreading within them. Daniel was the first to break the silence, his voice filled with a mix of determination and despair. "Claire, we can't just stay here, waiting for him to destroy us. We need to do something." His mind frantically searched for solutions, but everything seemed useless in the face of Ethan's cold manipulation. "And what can we do?" Claire replied, her voice trembling, still dominated by fear. "He knows everything, Daniel. He holds the cards in his hand, and we have no idea what he intends to do with it." Daniel shook his head, frustrated. He wasn't used to feeling helpless, and the situation was eating him up inside. But even in the face of adversity, there was a part of him that was unwilling to give in, that refused to accept defeat. He knew that somehow they would need to face Ethan on his own terms. "We need to face him, Claire," Daniel said finally, his voice firm, although fear was still present in his eyes. "We can't just wait for his next move. We have to find a way to turn the tide." Claire looked at him, her eyes shining with new understanding. What Daniel was proposing was madness, but the alternative was simply to wait for inevitable destruction. She knew Ethan wouldn't stop until they were both completely ruined, and the thought of remaining passive in the face of that was unbearable. "But how, Daniel?" she asked, trying to find some logic amidst the chaos. "How can we face it without destroying ourselves in the process?" Daniel sighed deeply, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He knew that they would need to be intelligent, that they could not act on impulse. Ethan was cunning, but there was also an arrogance in his behavior, an overconfidence in his ability to manipulate. If they could find a loophole, a weak point, perhaps they could reverse the situation. "We need to think like him," Daniel said slowly, ideas beginning to form in his mind. "We need to find out what his true goals are, what he really wants from us. And then we'll use that against him." Claire pondered Daniel's words. The idea of facing Ethan at his own game was terrifying, but at the same time, it was the only alternative they had. She knew she couldn't go back on the choices she made, but maybe she could control the outcome of this story somehow. "Do you think we can fool him?" Claire asked, her tone more hopeful, yet hesitant. "It won't be easy," Daniel admitted. "But we have no choice. Ethan thinks he has everything under control, but he doesn't expect us to fight back. If we play our cards right, we can turn the tide before he realizes what's happening." Claire nodded, feeling a renewed determination rise within her. There was still fear, but now there was also a flame of resistance, a desire not to be defeated without a fight. "Let's find out what he wants, Daniel," she said, her voice now firmer. "And when we know, we'll use it against him." The two exchanged a look of mutual understanding. There was no more time for hesitation or regrets. They were in a life-or-death situation, and they needed to find a way to get out of it with as little damage as possible. The decision had been made, they would face Ethan head-on, but this time, with the intention of surpassing the game master. The moral dilemma that presented itself was complex. They would have to delve into the same manipulation tactics they so despised about Ethan. They would have to choose between remaining faithful to their principles or sinking into the same abyss of lies and manipulation. But one thing was clear, retreat was no longer an option. With this resolution, Daniel and Claire began to plan their next steps, aware that each move would be crucial. As the night wore on, they knew that the final confrontation was near, and that this could be the last act of a dangerous game they were about to play. The final confrontation unfolded silently, almost imperceptibly to those watching from the outside. Ethan, always one step ahead, patiently awaited Claire and Daniel's response. He knew that desperation would drive them to act, and he was prepared for whatever came. But what he didn't expect was the boldness with which they would face the situation. Claire and Daniel, aware that they were at a crossroads, made a bold decision. They knew that to defeat Ethan, they would need to risk everything. They began moving the pieces on the board with almost surgical precision, manipulating information, creating distractions, and planting the seed of doubt. Ethan, believing he was in control, didn't realize how much the situation was changing around him. Finally, the decisive night arrived. Claire arranged a meeting with Ethan at his loft, claiming that she needed to talk, that she was ready to face the consequences of her actions. Ethan, with his sense of superiority, accepted the invitation, convinced that he was about to complete his revenge perfectly. When Ethan entered the loft, the tension in the air was palpable. Claire was waiting for him with a calm, almost resigned expression, but there was something in her eyes that he couldn't immediately identify. Daniel was absent, or at least that's what Ethan thought. But in fact, he was watching everything closely, ready to act at the right moment. "Ethan," Claire began, her voice soft but firm. "I know we did terrible things to each other. But I can't continue living with this burden. I'm ready to end this, once and for all." Ethan confidently took a step forward, approaching her. "Finally, Claire. I knew you would get to this point. I always knew there was no way for you to escape." But before he could say anything else, Claire took a step back, and with a quick movement, picked up something that was on the table. It was a recorder, which she turned on before Ethan could react. His voice echoed through the room, every word of his meticulously calculated plans, every threat he had made to Claire and Daniel. Everything was there, recorded perfectly. Ethan froze. For the first time, he realized that he had underestimated Claire. She had recorded him, capturing every incriminating word he had said during their previous encounters. All the confidence he had in his plan began to crumble. "What did you do, Claire?" Ethan growled, feeling his anger rising. "Just what you would do, Ethan." Claire replied, her tone now firmer. "I used your own tactics against you. The game has changed, and now you are no longer in control." Daniel entered the room at that moment, his gaze determined. He had his phone in his hand, ready to send the recordings to the police and Ethan's lawyers. Ethan knew that if those recordings were released, his entire career and reputation would be over. "There's no way out for you now, Ethan," Daniel said, approaching. "You put us against the wall, and now you have to deal with the consequences." Ethan, feeling the ground disappear beneath his feet, tried to think of a solution, but he knew he was trapped. Claire and Daniel had played their cards perfectly, turning the tide at the last moment. "Do you think you won?" Ethan said, with a last bit of arrogance. "This won't end here." Claire looked at him, her eyes cold and determined. "It's over, Ethan," she replied, turning off the recorder and putting it away. "The only thing you can do now is accept that you lost." Ethan realized he was defeated, and the reality of his situation finally hit him hard. He was about to lose everything, not just because of his betrayal, but because he underestimated the people he thought he controlled. Realizing his defeat was imminent, Ethan made one last choice, one that would seal his fate forever. In one swift movement, he turned and left the loft, leaving Claire and Daniel behind. That night, Ethan disappeared, leaving only a terse message in his office, resigning his position and transferring all assets to Claire. Claire and Daniel, despite being free from Ethan's control, knew they could never go back to the way they were before. The betrayal, manipulation, and mind games left deep scars. But instead of wallowing in regret, they decided to move forward, each taking a separate path, but with a new understanding of what it really means to live with the consequences of one's choices. Ethan, in turn, was never seen again. He became a shadow, a ghost that roamed the world, haunted by the choices he made. Her story became a cautionary tale, a reminder that, in the end, true power lies in the ability to recognize when you no longer have control. The game finally ended, but the lessons each learned on that dangerous board remained forever. And so, the city of New York continued to pulsate, indifferent to the dramas unfolding in its streets, while the characters in this story moved forward, carrying with them the weight of their actions and the hope of a better future, even if uncertain.